Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 19 of What If Naruto Was in Rosario Vampire. If you guys enjoyed this What If, and want to see part 20 of it, comment down below, and let me know. And go ahead, and check out other What Ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. You called. Naruto glared. It was the third and last night that he was going to try this, and just as he was about to stop, at 4 AM, mind you, this asshole decides to finally show up. If he was being honest, he was surprised he hadn't thrown a tantrum, because his idea hadn't yielded any results until now. Yokai are attracted to power. He mockingly mimicked the headmaster's words in his head. Be loud, be obnoxious, you'll get their attention. He could be loud, he could be obnoxious. That was basically how he described himself for the past nearly 18 years. Or, well, was it over 50,000 years now technically? He didn't really have a clue. That stupid powerful and immortal vampire had more than a few screws loose. He kind of just nodded his head and agreed with her ramblings, because he needed her help, which he only received after she'd had enough of making him feel like he was a kid again. Whether she was telling the truth or not, he'd leave that for another time. Why did you only come now? The man smiled, eerily reminiscent of a snake. Actually, the man kind of reminded him of Kabuto now that he thought about it. He even had the same pair of glasses. My master thought it would be best to leave you to your own devices for a while. And who is this master of yours? If you come with me, perhaps you'll find out. The lookalike approached him, his short silver hair blowing harshly in the strong winds. Well, they were stood up at the peak of one of the many skyscrapers. He held out his hand. You don't need to be scared. The man coerced. I can't promise that he won't bite, but you are familiar with him. I'm not scared. Naruto snapped in annoyance. He'd been going to high points in Tokyo, and unleashing as much power as he could just so he could get into this situation. There was no way he was going to refuse the offer. He snatched the man's hand firmly. His next plan of action had been to ask what they were going to do, but stopped himself when he noticed they weren't on the roof of the building anymore. Neat. Right? Were they underground? The dark hall with only a hanging light bulb suggested so, but he'd been in some equally shitty places that had been on the surface too. Their footsteps echoed as they walked to seemingly nowhere, passing the same hanging light bulb a handful of times. It was really the only interesting thing in the place. There wasn't even rats that ran around to keep his attention. Where are we? Tokyo, Japan. Underground. Underground. Oh? His lips twisted. How plain. How'd you get us here? Me? Oh no, that wasn't me. I don't have any power like that. That was my master's doing. What does he want with me? The moment he'd said it, the last light in the hall revealed a metal door at the end of the hall. He wants you to fight, Uzumaki Naruto. Fight who? The Kabuto clone forced open the metal door with a grunt of effort. It was thick, very thick. It'd take a lot of firepower to bust through that thing. Anyone willing. Beyond the door was a large room, set out like the cafeteria back at the academy with a few obvious differences. Instead of wood, the tables and seats were made out of steel, the floor was stone, and the entire room reeked of blood and sweat. The people inhabiting the room were also very different. Big, burly and vicious-looking men were the vast majority, each of their expressions as bloodthirsty as the last. There had to be thousands of them, all squished together at their tables and devouring their meals. It was a wonder that no fights were taking place. These guys. The event will begin in 20 minutes. The man had begun to backtrack, moving to make his exit. Prepare yourself until then, maybe try to make some friends too. Ruby was awakened by the knocks. She ignored them at first, preferring to roll over and curl further into the sheets. When they came for the second time, she managed to convince herself that she was delusional and just hearing things. The third set was sharper and louder, dragging her from her potential slumber. Service. She grumbled, tossed and turned, squeaking her eye open at the digital clock resting on top of the bedside table. 4 AM, was this some prank? It was too early for room service to make an unannounced visit. Huffing, she rolled over, and snapped her eyes back closed, silently cursing whoever was out in the hall. The knocking came back the moment she'd stopped moving, along with an announcement following. Uzumaki-san, it's the police. We just want to ask a few questions. Shit. The headmaster had told her to be wary of the authorities, to be as dismissive as she could, if she were to ever interact with them. She had mostly brushed it off, figuring it was just a general warning considering what had happened in Fujimi. He believed the city was destroyed under the orders of someone with a lot of political power. She hadn't really cared to listen to his ramblings much at first, but after hearing that they had found diamonds, truckloads worth, according to the article in the newspaper, under the city, it had made her a bit suspicious. Coincidences like that didn't just happen, at least that's what the headmaster kept telling her. She hurled the covers off her body, and quickly slipped into the bathroom, snatching up a white bathrobe, and threw it over herself, slipping her arms through the sleeves, and tying it at the waist. They must have been able to hear her fumbling around. Another knock hadn't came to the door since she'd gotten up and out of bed. She could hear small murmuring as she approached the door, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Ruby picked up the small card the hotel had given them and swept it to unlock the door, slowly pulling it open. "Hello." "Hi," she replied. Her lips twitched awkwardly. There was 3 men stood outside her room, 2 of which were in a stand police uniform. It was the silent and stoic man behind them that caught most of her attention. He clearly wasn't Japanese. His build was stocky, his face was somewhat pudgy, coupled with dirty blonde hair and a pair of brown eyes. He wore a straight black suit accompanied by an equally black tie. The man could have easily passed as a bodyguard for someone important. "Uzumaki-san?" "No?" She gave the officer closest to her door a weird look before putting on a frown. She'd play as clueless as she could for now. "Uzumaki-san left early this morning and hasn't returned since." She frowned deeper. "You don't know where he is, do you?" "No, unfortunately." The officer smiled. "And who might you be?" "A business partner." "A business partner?" "Yes. Business partners that sleep together." The man smirked a little. Did he think he'd won some sort of personal victory? She could feel her face begin to warm up. "I take the couch." She lied. They had been sleeping in the same bed. Well, kind of. Naruto had only came back in the early hours of the morning during the few days they'd been in Tokyo, and would then proceed to pass out next to her, snoring his head off until he woke up 5 or 6 hours later. Of course. The officer gave her a quick smile. For a moment, Ruby's eyes locked with the stoic man in the back, but he didn't react, and instead continued to stare straight back at her. "Do you know when Uzumaki-san might be back?" "No." All of her answers had been short and blunt. She wanted to add more, to say that she didn't even know where he was. The headmaster had been made himself very clear. When he told her to give them as little as possible information, she wasn't going to disobey, even if what she said might help her current situation. "Okay, well." The officer reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to her. "When he returns, make sure to give us a call." "I will." Her eyes once more met the large man's before the door was closed. There was something about him that really put her off. Leaning her back against the door, Ruby sighed as she heard their footsteps disappear. Would they have to move locations when Naruto got back? If the authorities were after him, then it was a definite possibility. It was a shame. She liked the place. Ruby pulled the bathrobe over her head and tossed it carelessly on the floor, fiddling with her bra strap and the panties that had messed up during her sleep. She ran her hands through her hair and made her way over to where most of their belongings were located. Thankfully they hadn't taken much out. It meant much less repacking that she had to do. His current situation was perfect. Too perfect. The Kabuto lookalike's master, Naruto really wanted to meet him. But first, he had to wait for this event to start. Whatever it was, he was going to win it. 3 minutes. He hadn't tried to speak to anyone else in the room, and they similarly ignored him. Instead, he found a spot to sit down and gather nature chakra. His goal was to show off. He wasn't going to hold back. In the back of his mind, he hoped there was someone as strong as Akio here. 2 minutes. It still amazed him how much the yokai in the room wanted to kill each other, yet not even a single one of them acted on those feelings. There wasn't even a disagreement despite there being thousands of them. What was keeping them in line, keeping them on their best behavior? Was it this master he'd never seen? He was the only candidate he had to point at with his questions. 1 minute. He idly wondered how much power you had to have to get so many yokai to be so obedient. Naruto had fought plenty of them so far, and none of them had backed down from fighting him. Naruto blinked. He wasn't in the smelly and sweaty room any longer. He'd been teleported without even realizing it again. The place he'd moved to was massive. It had to be at least a couple of square kilometers, and maybe 500 meters or so high. The walls, floor and ceiling were all white. There wasn't any lights, but he could see perfectly. A couple of 100 meters ahead of him was someone else, big, burly and practically reeking of killing intent. Naruto could make out the tank top that was big enough to work its way around the yokai's giant chest as well as the camo pants he wore. Without warning, the monster charged. He was quick, cleared the distance between them in just a few seconds, the sound of his stomps resounding throughout the massive empty space they were in. Naruto swung his arm. The back of his fist made contact with his assailant's cheek, bones snapping under the force. The yokai rocketed away from him, body spinning out of control. The booming sound of his body slamming into the wall reached Naruto's ears, and he was once more inside the room which had previously hosted thousands of dangerous monsters. Now, there was only a few, including him. A screen opened up horizontally in front of his face, a dark background, with 3 tabs sticking out of the top of it, each labeled in order: overall, time, and feed. Naruto looked around. 20 or so people had joined back into the room since he'd been there. None of them had the same screen he did, but they all looked like they were messing with something in front of them. Every second that passed by, more and more yokai rejoined the room, either keeping to themselves and poking the air in front of them, or bragging to others about their fight. Naruto frowned and poked the feed tab. To his amazement, the mostly transparent screen instantly responded to his touch. A video began playing in the middle of it. It showed the same large white space he just fought in, only with two people he didn't recognize trying to best each other. To the right of that was a list for the streams of different fights, all labeled numerically. He tapped the overall tab. The first thing he recognized was his name. He noticed all of the other names, and they lay out second. 3 columns: number, name, and score. Now he was starting to understand the event more. It was a ranking system based on your fights. Right now, Naruto was 13th with a score of 1. He flicked the scoreboard down, the screen quickly scrolled down, and he let it go until it stopped at the bottom. Last place was 693rd with a score of 1. He flicked it again. 701st with a score of 1. The list was dynamically updated. He even managed to see a few yokai get teleported back in, and then proceed to find them near the bottom of it. Neat. 10 minutes had passed by the time Naruto had been teleported back into the white room. He grumbled as the screen had disappeared from his view, and he was instead met with the ugly face of a charging yokai. Naruto hit the impatient idiot with an uppercut, sending him head first into the ceiling. Before he knew it, he was back with the screen in front of him once more. He wasn't so familiar with teleportation, then there was no doubt he'd start freaking out over the constant change of location. The other yokai must be used to being teleported around all the time. He didn't notice any of them reacting negatively. Naruto tapped the time tab, ignoring the monsters appearing around him. He finished the fight quicker than his first at least. Now his record was 4.5 seconds, which was apparently the 30th quickest fight so far. First place was less than a quarter of a second. Naruto wanted to fight him. The third and fourth fights were much the same. His opponents would run at him with a scream, and he'd punt them across the room. Maybe Senjutsu was a bit too much for small fry like them. He even had plenty of time to refresh it between rounds, but it sure was fun to see how fast and far he could send people. He predicted the fifth to go the same way. It was always the same room, clean and untouched, as if no one had ever been in it before. While Naruto hadn't caused much destruction, he'd seen the fights that had dragged on. The damage they left behind was significant. It made him wonder, were the rooms repaired in between rounds, or were they always different ones? Both seemed just as unlikely as the other. His opponent didn't give him any warning as he attacked, which Naruto thought was a bit rude. All the others had been nice enough to offer a loud noise for him to notice before they were anywhere near him. The fist slammed into his chest, sinking itself in before he was rocketed back through the air, only to be stopped when his back slammed into the wall. The yokai hadn't had enough there apparently, launching back in with an onslaught of blows, pushing him further and further into the wall with every swing, making a mess around them. Naruto snatched the hairy arm before he was hit again. Nope, it wasn't hair, it was fur. The blonde hadn't noticed the transformation while he was being attacked, but it was like he was up against skin. The werewolf stood in front of him, lips curled back menacingly, a low growl emanating from its throat. Instead of attempting to yank its arm free, the yokai attacked with the one that wasn't held captive. Naruto's head jerked back from the force, and he groaned in complaint. He'd felt that one. Its arm reared back, and was ready to launch another hit, but Naruto wasn't having any of it. He leaned forward, and slammed his free hand into the werewolf's stomach, simultaneously releasing the arm he'd been holding onto. The werewolf bounced along the ground several times, eventually rolling to a slow stop. Naruto peeled himself out of the wall, brushing off the bits of concrete. The werewolf had begun to pick itself up, but the blonde had let it have its fun. He used the seal he placed on the yokai's arm to appear by his side, pulling his fist, and bringing it down on the back of the werewolf's head like a hammer to an anvil. The floor gave in under the force, cracking, splintering and uprooting itself to form a crater. He was already back in the waiting room. There was nowhere near as many monsters left as there was when they started. After each round, their numbers would be cut in half as a minimum. It wasn't rare for both combatants to render each other unable to fight. Thinking about the numbers, he wondered how many had died. He was unaware as to whether he caused any deaths. He was always teleported back before he could see a result, but there had to have been a significant amount of blood spilled. Naruto shook his head and took a seat at one of the metal benches. He'd think about it later. Akira stormed through the halls. How dare those two run off on their own? She'd spent all that time buttering them up and getting them to join Fairy Tail. There was no way she was going to let them ruin that so easily. They were under her care, and they were going to do what they were told. Having trouble. Go away. At first, his random and sudden appearances would make her jump. It was a consequence of being allied with someone who could teleport practically anywhere, she supposed. It had taken some time, but she'd gotten accustomed to it. Don't be like that. Obito's eyes were half-lidded, a small smirk resting on his lips. He was always like that. No matter how many enemies she dominated, no matter how strong they were, he'd never once taken her seriously. He treated her like she was still a child. We're supposed to be partners, aren't we? Yeah, right. Akira scoffed and pushed past him. She didn't know what kind of deal he had with the subdivision leaders in Jaikuro, but she could feel his power rise every time they went out and killed more of those beasts' apparent clones, despite him never taking any part in the actual combat. It was unsettling. She always made sure to stay cautious around him, no matter how nice or casual he tried to play. This is my mess, I'll clean it up. Is that so? He strode up and walked by her side. Then I want you to do something for me. Her eyes flicked towards him, glaring. What? If you see Naruto, don't try to kill him. Akio stopped. Why? She sneered at him in annoyance. You don't think I can? I know you can't. He was blunt and honest, for once. Usually, he danced around any questioning before offering her an answer that didn't actually resolve anything. You ran from him last time. You knew you were in over your head, didn't you? She'd never admit to such a thing out loud, and even loathed to admit it to herself. They'd been just about even up until the point he turned himself into a portable light bulb. The amount of power rolling off him so easily was monstrous. Obito leaned in closer to her, his voice low. He was holding back. Bullshit. His strange, mismatched eyes twinkled with amusement. I wish it was. Everything would be so much easier. Akio remained silent for a few moments. You sure know a lot about him. She pointed out. Do you two have history together? Something like that. Tell me. He cocked an eyebrow at her. We're partners, aren't we? And he's my mess. Maybe she should have seen a response like that coming. I can't have you dying just yet, Shuzan. Don't do anything stupid. Tsukune couldn't sleep. He hadn't had a wink of it since Naruto left him to stew. There was too many questions in his head, and the more he thought about it, the more questions he had to ask. Why did he have to leave? That was the first question. What was so important that he had to drop everything he had here? Why so suddenly? That train of thought had then led him to an unwanted realization. He didn't know much about the blonde in the first place. Every time a conversation would get too personal, he'd change the topic. Where had he gone? When was he coming back? Was he even coming back? Why did Naruto leave him to deal with Mocha? He hadn't even let her know that he was leaving. It was left to Tsukune to tell her, to watch as her shining smile slowly disappeared. The girl visited him every day, acting like she was fine, but she wasn't any good at lying. It was as if she was lost, like she had no idea as to what she was supposed to do now that he wasn't there. Tsukune couldn't really blame her, he felt the same way. The only reason he'd stayed in the academy had been because of Naruto's presence, the only reason he felt like he might be able to survive it. He was Tsukune's mobile safe zone. More recently, Naruto had been training him to protect himself and he'd been amazing himself with what he could do. How the hell was he supposed to continue learning, when there was no one to teach him? He threw the thin bed sheets away and hopped off the bed, making his way to the bathroom. The doctors wouldn't let him leave until they were completely sure he wasn't in a life-threatening situation anymore, despite his insistence that he was fine. Even the arm he'd lost was back. He had no idea how. They hadn't sewed it back on. It was like it had grown itself back. Once again, his thoughts were back on Naruto. What had the blonde done to him? He said he'd made a deal with someone, but Tsukune had no idea what that was supposed to mean. He didn't feel any different at least. That was a good sign, right? Still, his stomach churned thinking about it. If it was nothing bad, then surely Naruto would have just told him what had happened. Maybe not. He didn't feel like he was able to tell what the blonde would do anymore. Tsukune turned the tap, gathering the cold water in his hands, before splashing his face. He hoped it would help refresh himself, maybe help him get his mind elsewhere. It didn't. The failure just left him disappointed and annoyed. After wiping himself dry, Tsukune took a look at himself in the mirror. He didn't look any different, just as unappealingly average as ever. He blinked. When his eyes opened, he noticed something in the mirror. Right beside his neck, rushing towards it. It almost looked like flesh, if a bit pale. The sharp needle-like object embedded itself into the side of his neck before he could react. Tsukune-kun. The voice was familiar, but he chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he swung his arm back, fist colliding with the wall behind him. The plaster and wood didn't offer any resistance, exploding outwards and blowing through the next wall into the hallway. He hadn't meant to do something like that. He was just trying to hit whoever had spoken as a knee-jerk reaction. He'd been able to do similar destruction when he'd been training with Naruto, but he was sure he hadn't called any chakra forth. He felt his neck get pierced again, next to his spine. Before he could verbally complain, another shot into the right side of his neck. That strength of yours is impressive. It's not surprising that trash like Mito couldn't deal with you. He tried to speak, to tell the woman to shut up and leave him alone, but no words came. His eyes began to widen, it was hard to breathe, his lungs started to rapidly deplete of oxygen. You'll prove useful to us. The last thing he saw was the reflection of the pleasantly smiling nurse behind him, her fingers elongated and sharpened in a grotesque manner, 3 of them plunged deep into his neck. Then, nothing. How many fights had it been now? Naruto had stopped bothering to count when he'd hit 20. He'd gotten bored of the repetitiveness. At first, he was fine with fighting any of the yokai he got paired up with. He got to show how much stronger he was, and he stayed at the top of the ranks without much effort, which was his problem with the whole thing. None of them were able to stand up to him, not even a little bit. It made the ordeal tedious, and he was tired of it. He was in the fight again. His opponent bellowed and charged, confident in his sprint. An uppercut to his jaw sent the yokai spiraling into the ceiling. Naruto sighed and leaned back against the wall. Idly, he took note of the ones who came out victorious in their fights, appearing around the room in the locations they'd been in before their fights. There wasn't many left now, only a handful. He started to recognize faces, many of which looked worse for wear. Bastard. Naruto creaked his eyes open, getting a good look at the snarling man stomping over to him. He looked kind of familiar, but a little different at the same time. He had a whole hat and a half of hide over the blonde. His physique was similar to the others, big and burly. He looked like he'd be able to take down the walls surrounding them just from his physical strength. Me. Another yokai tried to grab the approaching man's arm, to tell him not to, but was shrugged off and mostly ignored. You killed my brother. His face was scrunched up so hard that it made Naruto think it could explode. Are you sure? There's been a lot of. The yokai's large fist crashed into the wall beside him, cracking and denting it. You're probably going to have to pay for that. There was untamed fury in his black eyes. I'll kill you. His large hand snatched Naruto's collar, holding him up against the wall. I'll make you feel more pain than I'm feeling. Naruto had a smartest comment bubbling in the back of his throat, but it died the moment he realized they weren't in the waiting room they'd been in anymore. None of the other yokai were present either. Did you do that? Apparently not. It didn't even look like the man had taken notice of their new surroundings, blinded by his own anger. His large fist sailed towards the blonde, but never reached its target. Instead, he was roughly tossed into the wall, cracking the wood, and held there against his will. Calm yourself. Naruto's ears twitched. That voice was familiar. It was weaker, almost croaking, but he wouldn't be able to forget that sound in a million years. Behavior like that is unfitting for my fastest subordinate. Naruto swallowed in an attempt to curb his dry throat, but it didn't seem to help. His eyes traveled up the long, oval table planted in the center of the room until they landed on the obnoxiously big chair. Well, it was more like a throne, much more exquisite than the other scattered furniture. The chair was facing the large pane of glass, looking down on the city. You're not actually him, are you? Is him? He gathered his wits, before pacing round the table, bringing himself to stand in front of the man he'd long thought was dead. Orochimaru. Disappointed. He looked like he was on his last legs. His skin had always been pale, but never this badly. His eyes were droopy, as if it was difficult for him to just keep them open. Every breath he took was ragged and wheezy. More than that. Living as long as I have has its consequences, Naruto. He was hard to look at. This was a man that had been able to strike fear in anyone's heart just from the mention of his name. Naruto was almost convinced it was an illusion, seeing the man in such a pathetic state. 50,000 years is a long time. I can change my body as many times as I want, live as long as I want, but my very being is rotting at its core. Are you going to die? No? Not yet. I haven't been able to walk for nearly 3,000 years now. A weak yet still terrifyingly creepy smile made its way onto his face. At least, I wouldn't be dying while I'm still in this city. What do you mean by that? That can wait. The smile flickered a bit, diminishing slowly. It looked like he was putting a lot of effort into just moving his face. That's not what I brought you here for. I would have preferred you to finish the tournament, but there's no time for that anymore. I have a problem and you're going to fix it for me. Naruto snorted. Funny. You've still got a few screws loose, he said. Why in the world would I help with your problems? You've already met her, haven't you? The immortal. His thin lips twitched. Of course you have. That's why you came to this city again. She told you to build a reputation, gain attention. How do you know? She wanted you to meet me. We're going to work together, like it or not. He continued after a moment's pause, turning his arm and offering his hand to the blonde. Now, take my hand. They'll be here shortly, but you're going to stop them from getting what they want. Naruto glanced at the hand, fragile and shaking as it was held out for him. We're not going to work together, Orochimaru. That wasn't part of the deal. Seeing as we're both here though, you can answer some questions. You're being childish. I'll rip them out of your head, if I have to. Naruto looked the Sannin over. He belonged in a hospital, not a high-rise building. You're not in any condition to stop me either. Orochimaru frowned, his hand resting back on the arms of his chair. From behind the blonde, the window shattered, spraying his back and the floor with small, sharp bits of glass. The yokai had been somehow stuck to the wall against his will the entire time, dropped to the floor with a grunt. The strong winds from being so high up rushed into the room, blowing their hair and clothing around frantically. Well, the yokai soon lost his clothes, tearing them off as his body grew, fur growing out all over his body, face morphing into a snout, hands shifting into claws. Another werewolf. Naruto had only met one other werewolf tonight. Maybe he did kill his brother after all. Before Naruto could question what he was doing, the werewolf blasted past him. The moment he passed by, Naruto felt a new presence approaching at a very rapid rate. No, two of them. Their Yuki was excessively powerful, it kind of reminded him of Akira. Not a moment after the thought had gone through his head, an ear-deafening boom reached him, almost instantly followed by the werewolf soaring into the back of the room, slamming into the wall, and embedding himself there. Most of his torso was missing, his blood dripping from the large gap, one of his eyes hanging from his skull. Well, he died pretty quick if that was what Orochimaru had meant by fast. The two yokai were already here, he could sense them behind him, waiting patiently. Naruto turned to face them, pondering to himself curiously as he took in their appearance. They were practically a mirror of each other. Red, slitted eyes, messy ebony hair and a similar physical physique. But that wasn't what gained most of his attention, it was what they were wearing. Black military-esque uniforms clothed them, a black cap with an eagle spreading its wings, two swords strapped to his back and a cross. Mocha had described fighting and defeating someone wearing the same attire in Fujimi. Are you going to try and fight as well? The twin to his right had spoken up first, confidence in his tone. And what reason did he have to not be confident? The two of them had a good half-foot of height over the blonde, maybe a bit more. When you were taller than someone else, it gave you a strange sense of superiority, something Naruto had only felt a few times. That depends. What are you here for? The vampire nodded to Orochimaru, still seated behind the blonde, quietly keeping to himself. It was a wonder that he wasn't doing anything, he'd been the one to pin the now dead werewolf to the wall before, so he still had some manner of power at his disposal. Him. He took our lives, now we're going to take his. You look pretty alive to me. Revenge, huh? It was a simple yet solid motive every time he encountered someone with it on their minds. Naruto sighed. Besides, he's busy right now, you can come back tomorrow. He has questions to answer first. It was the left twin to react this time. Tilting his head, he smirked, apparently not taking the blonde very seriously. That's not an option. The quaking awoke Milka from her slumber. She frowned, rubbing her eyes with her knuckles, scrunching her face as another rumble rolled through the building. She yawned and stretched her arms above her head, lazily peering around her dorm room. Her hands came to rest on her lap, fiddling, waiting. It didn't happen again. Her eyes rolled back as her head hit her pillow once more, eyes shut, sleep coming to take her once more. Her idle and fading thoughts wondered what it had been. A loud, booming explosion made her eyes snap open. It had been much, much closer this time. It felt like the entire building was shaking, and screaming soon followed. Milka hurled her sheaths away from her body, throwing herself out of bed and slamming the door open, rushing down the hall towards the source. As her bare feet tapped each of the stairs, she questioned herself. What was she going to do when she got there? If it was a yokai going on a rampage, what could she actually do to stop them? Despite her thoughts, she continued on. The building shook again, the lights on the ceiling unhinging, windows shattering, walls cracking around her. She took a right turn, and ran into the lobby, skidding to a stop. Her eyes widened in shock and disbelief, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. It was Tsukune. He was there, holding up a female student against the wall, left hand tightly gripped around her neck. She scratched at his fingers and arms, but Tsukune didn't even flinch as her mouth opened and closed, begging for air. Tsukune. A shout grabbed his attention, his head turning her way. His eyes locked onto her own, dull and lifeless as they were. He raised his arm and wasted no time thrusting it forward, piercing the girl's chest without any resistance. Her face convulsed in shock, eyebrows furrowing like she was coming to the realization of what happened. Blood spurted from her mouth as Tsukune removed his arm, tossing her dying body to the floor. Milka couldn't believe what she was seeing. Tsukune was one of her closest friends, she knew what he was like. He'd never do something so vicious to anyone, let alone an innocent person. As he slowly began approaching her, she started to take slow steps back. Was he going to kill her too? She didn't want to die. Not yet. Tsukune. It wasn't her voice shouting his name this time, but it was very familiar. Gin-senpai. She didn't even see what happened. Tsukune had been coming towards her, then he was gone. The crash made her look back down the hall behind her, where Gin was holding Tsukune up against the wall by his collar. The role had reversed. What do you think you're doing? Gin bellowed, rearing Tsukune back, before slamming him into the wall again. The human didn't so much as grunt at the action. How many have you killed tonight? And just what were you planning to do with Milka-sen? Tsukune's arm raised and gripped their upperclassman's wrist, jerking it to the side and sending Gin through the wall beside them. She could hear him go through a few more out of sight. It was a shocking display. Sure, Tsukune had been training with Naruto, but it was hard to believe that he'd become stronger than Gin, especially not in the small amount of time it had been. Tsukune. He was approaching her again, at the same leisurely pace. I know you can hear me, Tsukune. You don't have to do this. Milka's words had no effect on him, he continued to march towards her. Suddenly, he stopped. His left arm fell to the ground, blood pooling. A sizable hole had been punched through his chest and left shoulder. Stumbling, the stony Tsukune fell back onto the floor with a thump. A cool breeze washed past. Shock prevalent on her face, she rushed over to her wounded friend, and kneeled down by his head. Tears started to well up in her eyes. What was she supposed to do? She knew first aid, but that wasn't going to help in the slightest. Tsukune, what? Well, that takes care of that. That was a voice she hadn't heard before. It sounded somewhat satisfied. Raising her head, biting her lips to keep them from trembling at her friend dying right beside her, she glared at the man. He had a strong face and a very fit appearance, accented by a karate uniform. He looked her over with a raised eyebrow and smiled. Did you happen to see a werewolf come by? Black hair, green eyes, and a stupid look on his face. He blinked, his eyes coming to focus over Mocha's head. Never mind. Haji. The newspaper club's president sounded far from happy. Mocha watched as his eyes darted between Tsukune's body and the karate uniform-clad man. What did you kill for him, you idiot? What? You said he had to be stopped. In stormed over. I didn't mean for you to kill him. Some fumbling and shuffling brought Mocha's attention back down to Tsukune. She gasped and hiccuped as Tsukune slowly began to pick himself up off the floor. The hole in his chest had repaired itself, and his arm had almost fully regenerated. Once he was fully standing once again, he looked towards Gin and Haji, his eyes still as lifeless as they were before. Looks like I didn't. Naruto smiled. It wasn't with anyone from the tournament, but he got what he'd wished for. The left twin was the one to make the first move, dashing forward so quick that the sound barrier broke within his first few steps. He'd landed hundreds of blows on Naruto in mere moments, but he suffered from what most who prioritized speed suffered from. Power. The punches coming towards him at supersonic speeds were pushing him back as he did his best to defend himself, but his senjutsu worked wonders for his endurance. This was the moment when the other twin decided it was time for him to join in. He wasn't nearly as fast as his lookalike, but still quick enough on his feet to take the chance to slip behind the blonde, bringing his fist down towards the side of his head. Naruto was able to raise his arm in time to block it. He wasn't, however, able to defend against the yokai's physical strength. His arm crumbled against the force, slamming back into his chest so hard it winded him. The floor beneath him gave out as he was rocketed towards the bottom, crashing through 30 or so floors before he came to an abrupt stop. Debris fell around and on top of him, dust pouring out from where he'd landed. The blonde coughed and sat himself up, raising his left arm and catching a wooden beam before it crashed on top of him. Tossing it aside, he got back to his feet and glanced around. He was in a lobby, and in front of him was a desk, a female clerk seated behind it. Her mouth was agape as she stared at him with a strange look. Hey, he said. Nice night. Her head tilted slightly. Naruto shrugged. Kurama's chakra flooded his system, a golden cloak of chakra surrounding him as it had many times before. Above was a giant hole. He could probably fit 10 of himself through it without a problem. He bent his knees, a resounding boom and a shockwave flinging the debris around him in random places over the lobby as he launched himself straight back up the way he'd came. Dumping 30 floors straight up a building sounded more difficult in his head. When he'd reached the room they were in, he saw who he assumed was the twin who'd sent him on his temporary trip back to Earth. He pulled his fist, ready to blow the weak and vulnerable Orochimaru's head into oblivion. Naruto was tempted to just let them do it. He certainly had no love for the conniving snake. Unfortunately, he was probably the only one who'd give him answers. He looped one arm around each of the twins' chests as he rushed between them, his leap from the edge, causing a heap of the glass in the upper and lower floors to shatter as he broke through the sound barrier again, soaring them through the next building over, and the next one. Before skidding to a stop in the third one, tossing each of them through separate walls in the unpopulated office floor. It was still dark and very early in the morning, so thankfully no one had come to attend their jobs and ultimately get in the way. The much faster twin got to him first, as Naruto had assumed he would. Bringing up his arm, the blonde caught his assailant by the neck, wrenching his wrist and snapping the yokai's neck with a resounding crack. No? Naruto tossed the corpse and turned his attention to Orochimaru's would-be killer, eyes wide open in shock and horror, body shaking and looking like he was about to cry. That sad made 2 brothers he'd killed tonight. He begun to slowly walk towards the only one left, slowly breathing in, gathering chakra in his lungs. His target, for all the strength and confidence he'd shown before, looked on with fear and anger in his eyes. He stood stock still, in shock, unmoving, unsure what to do. Naruto huffed out his breath, a loud whistle accompanying it as the wind sliced through the furniture and cubicles, tearing through the yokai, and painting the room with his innards. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want a next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification, and also check out the other videos that I have created, and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.